Have you ever walked into a room and immediately sensed who was lying, who was in pain, who was pretending to be someone they're not? If so, you might be living with what Carl Jung called the most dangerous psychological gift. Jung's most terrifying discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who see everything others miss and why this ability systematically destroys them. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he termed differentiated perception. These individuals could read micro-expressions, others couldn't detect sense-hidden emotions that remained invisible to everyone else, and perceive psychological patterns that escaped even trained professionals. They saw through social masks instantly. They detected lies the moment they were spoken. They felt the unconscious tensions filling every room they entered. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these people consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. The case that revealed Jung's most dangerous discovery began in 1913 during Jung's own psychological crisis following his break with Freud. A patient came to him representing what Jung would later categorize as the rarest personality type. She possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? Jung wrote in his private notes that this patient displayed an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others. But this faculty appeared to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective, unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. Today, I'll show you Jung's most dangerous discovery about people who see everything, and why he believed this rare ability either destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. Jung began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon, where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. He wrote in his Red Book period notes that there are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. Modern research validates Jung's early observations. Studies show that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population who don't just feel deeply, but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung documented 4 distinct patterns within this rare type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. These individuals don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely, they often can't distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote that the feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred. Not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote that these individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment. Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung wrote that nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment than the unlived life of the parent. But he discovered this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experience this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd express concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence. It was psychological defense. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter. Not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed that the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening to both individual and collective well-being. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote that the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective, unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of superior function, when your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. He wrote that the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective, unconscious contents. He wrote that the danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation and the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. Jung studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. He was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy, but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. Jung wrote about Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of using his perception in service of healing, he wielded it as a weapon against society. Jung wrote that Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. In contrast, Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, and the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. Jung wrote that Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from what he called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book. Jung wrote that he was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by his ability to understand what was happening to him through his work with patients. His superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him till he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. Jung documented 4 common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. The inflation trap occurs when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. Jung warned that the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Jung called the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. The withdrawal justification happens when individuals use their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convince themselves that others are too unconscious to be worth engaging, which Jung recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wisdom. Jung wrote that true individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The helper's high occurs when some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to see and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. Jung warned that when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. The overwhelm return can happen even to successfully integrated individuals during periods of stress trauma or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded with others' unconscious contents again. Jung emphasized that integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote that the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude, daily allowing absorbed material to settle, so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. This practice involves sitting quietly without external stimulation and observing what thoughts, feelings, and sensations arise naturally, versus what feels foreign or imposed. Phase 2. Shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. When you accept your own capacity for the behaviors you observe in others, you stop being shocked or disturbed by human nature and can perceive it with compassion rather than horror. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious and the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote that the individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Think of it like being a skilled therapist who can deeply understand a client's pain without taking it home. Because individuals with superior perception often face isolation, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand others, capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Fellow individuated persons are those who have completed significant psychological development themselves. Jung wrote that the individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence and authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. Those engaged in individuation are people actively engaged in their own psychological development through therapy, inner work, or spiritual practice. They may not possess superior perception themselves, but they understand its value. Jung wrote that those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Natural containers are individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called natural container function, and the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges and developed emotional stability. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Jung taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. Begin with small, gentle observations. Notice their response pattern to feedback. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. Jung emphasized that the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image. The 4 stages of transformation begin with recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is not, what one wishes to be or fears to be. Integration without isolation involves learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but engages with it more consciously. Service without sacrifice happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer, rather than a burden you carry. Jung called this conscious participation, using your abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole. Legacy without attachment involves what Jung called transcendent function, using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. The individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Jung wrote that what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that people with superior perception serve as what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their insights. They served as advanced scouts for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. What appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole. Jung believed that in the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns that explain collective behavior, environmental and social unsustainability. Before it becomes obvious spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, technological implications that others haven't considered, and collective shadow contents that need conscious integration. Jung's insight was that the sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. Superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung wrote that the individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. At the highest level of development, Jung observed that individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who came to him during his own psychological crisis. After 3 years of working with Jung's individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological contents and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor where her differentiated perception helped troubled individuals. She built relationships with people who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious development. Jung wrote about her transformation, that the patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most dangerous discovery, that some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration wisdom and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be: consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see everything. It's that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. Understanding Jung's theory intellectually is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you begin applying his integration principles to your daily experience as a highly perceptive individual. Let me share what this looks like in practice, drawn from Jung's detailed case notes and modern applications of his work. Morning consciousness practice begins with what Jung called conscious differentiation. Before engaging with others, spend 15 minutes in complete silence, observing what thoughts, emotions, and sensations arise naturally from within you. This establishes your baseline psychological state before absorbing external material. Jung wrote that without this daily practice of recognizing your authentic inner voice, the highly perceptive individual becomes a psychological sponge absorbing everything without discrimination. This morning practice creates what he called conscious boundaries, the ability to maintain your individual identity while remaining open to perception. The workplace navigation challenge presents unique difficulties for highly perceptive individuals. Jung observed that these individuals often struggle in traditional work environments because they perceive dysfunctions that others unconsciously agree to ignore. The key is learning what Jung called strategic participation, engaging consciously rather than withdrawing completely. When you sense tension in a meeting, resist the urge to immediately address what you perceive. Instead, Jung taught a process he called conscious holding. Acknowledge internally what you're sensing without feeling compelled to act on it immediately. This prevents you from becoming the scapegoat while allowing you to use your perceptions constructively when timing is appropriate. Jung documented specific language patterns that allow highly perceptive individuals to share insights without triggering defensive responses. Instead of saying, "You seem angry," try, "I'm sensing some tension in the room." Instead of, "You're being dishonest," try, "Something feels incomplete about this conversation." This shifts from personal accusation to environmental observation. Relationship dynamics become particularly complex for those with superior perception. Jung noted that intimate relationships often amplify the participation mystique phenomenon, where boundaries between your psychological contents and your partners become completely blurred. Jung taught couples where one partner possessed superior perception to establish what he called conscious intimacy protocols. The highly perceptive partner learns to distinguish between their own emotional states and what they're absorbing from their partner. The non-perceptive partner learns to communicate their internal states directly rather than expecting them to be intuited. This prevents the common pattern where the highly perceptive partner becomes responsible for managing all emotional awareness in the relationship while losing contact with their own inner experience. Social gatherings present ongoing challenges that Jung addressed extensively in his work with introverted intuitives. Large groups amplify unconscious contents, exponentially creating what Jung called collective unconscious flooding for highly sensitive individuals. Jung developed specific protocols for social engagement. Arrive slightly late to avoid absorbing the initial anxiety of gathering. Position yourself with your back to a wall to minimize unconscious input from multiple directions. Take regular breaks in solitude to discharge absorbed material. Leave before exhaustion sets in, rather than trying to endure until the end. These aren't signs of weakness or social inadequacy. They're conscious strategies for managing extraordinary psychological abilities in environments not designed for them. The decision-making process becomes complicated when you're constantly receiving unconscious information from others. Jung observed that highly perceptive individuals often struggle with major life decisions because they're influenced not just by their own authentic desires, but by the unconscious expectations and projections of everyone around them. Jung taught a process he called authentic choice recognition. When facing important decisions, spend extended time in complete isolation from others' opinions and expectations. Allow all absorbed material to settle until you can distinguish between what you genuinely want and what others unconsciously want from you. This process often reveals that many life choices highly perceptive individuals make are actually unconscious accommodations to others' unspoken needs, rather than authentic personal decisions. Career development requires special consideration for those with superior perception. Jung noted that traditional career paths often fail to utilize their abilities constructively while exposing them to overwhelming psychological environments. Jung identified several career categories that naturally accommodate superior perception: therapeutic professions, where perception serves healing creative fields, where insight generates artistic expression; consulting roles, where pattern recognition provides value; research positions where deep observation contributes to understanding, and educational settings where wisdom can be shared gradually. The key is finding environments where your perceptive abilities are valued rather than feared, where seeing clearly is considered an asset rather than a threat. Physical health considerations often receive inadequate attention in discussions of superior perception. Jung documented that highly perceptive individuals frequently experience what he called somatic absorption, where they unconsciously absorb not just emotional states, but physical symptoms from others. They might develop headaches in response to others' stress, experience digestive issues when around people with eating disorders, or feel inexplicably fatigued after spending time with depressed individuals. This isn't hypochondria or psychosomatic illness. It's the physical manifestation of psychological absorption. Jung taught body awareness practices specifically for highly perceptive individuals. Regular physical exercise helps discharge absorbed emotional energy. Adequate sleep becomes crucial because psychological processing continues unconsciously during rest. Nutrition requires special attention because absorbed stress affects digestion and metabolism. Most importantly, Jung emphasized that highly perceptive individuals need significantly more solitude than others, not because they're antisocial, but because they require time to process and integrate the vast amounts of unconscious material they absorb daily. The spiritual dimension of superior perception received extensive attention in Jung's later work. He observed that many highly perceptive individuals experience what he called spontaneous religious experiences, direct encounters with transcendent reality that occur without traditional religious practice. These experiences often involve sensing the interconnectedness of all consciousness, perceiving archetypal patterns underlying human behavior, or experiencing direct knowing that transcends rational thought. Jung emphasized that these aren't pathological symptoms, but evolutionary developments in consciousness. However, Jung warned against what he called spiritual inflation, where individuals become identified with these experiences rather than integrating them consciously. The goal isn't to become a spiritual teacher or guru, but to integrate transcendent experiences into balanced psychological development. Technology and media consumption require conscious management for highly perceptive individuals. Jung couldn't have anticipated modern digital environments, but his principles apply directly. Social media amplifies unconscious contents exponentially. News consumption can become overwhelmingly absorbing, and digital communication often lacks the nuanced information highly perceptive individuals rely on for accurate assessment. Jung would likely recommend strict boundaries around media consumption, regular digital detoxes, and prioritizing face-to-face interaction where full perceptual information is available. The creative expression outlet becomes essential rather than optional for highly perceptive individuals. Jung observed that creative work provides a constructive channel for processing overwhelming perceptual input, whether through writing, art, music, or movement. Creative expression allows the transformation of absorbed psychological material into something beautiful and meaningful. Jung noted that many highly perceptive individuals suppress their creative impulses because they seem impractical or self-indulgent. But Jung viewed creative expression as psychologically necessary for this type, a vital component of healthy integration rather than a luxury hobby. Community building represents one of Jung's most important recommendations for highly perceptive individuals. He emphasized that isolation, while necessary for processing, becomes destructive when it becomes permanent withdrawal from all human connection. Jung's most advanced students eventually transcended basic integration to become what he called conscious participants in the collective unconscious. This represents the highest development of superior perception, where individuals learn to work directly with the psychological forces shaping humanity's development. Advanced practitioners develop what Jung termed archetypal awareness, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns underlying human behavior. They begin recognizing when personal psychological dynamics reflect larger collective movements, when individual symptoms point to cultural shadow contents, and when their own inner development serves broader evolutionary purposes. Jung observed that these individuals often experience what he called prophetic dreams, visions of potential futures, based on unconscious trends they're sensing in the collective. These aren't supernatural predictions, but sophisticated pattern recognition operating at levels most people cannot access. The dreams reveal likely outcomes if current psychological trajectories continue unchanged. The conscious prophet learns to interpret these visions not as fixed destinies, but as warning systems. They understand that their role is to help make unconscious collective trends conscious so that destructive patterns can be altered before they manifest in external events. This represents the ultimate integration of superior perception in service of collective healing. Jung documented specific techniques for working with archetypal material. Active imagination involves conscious dialogue with the unconscious forces you're perceiving, allowing them to communicate their messages directly, rather than overwhelming you with chaotic input. Dream analysis becomes a tool for understanding not just personal psychology, but collective psychological movements. Symbol recognition helps identify when personal experiences carry transpersonal significance. The conscious artist emerges as one of Jung's most important archetypal expressions. These individuals channel their overwhelming perceptions into creative works that help others understand psychological realities they couldn't access directly. Through art, music writing, or other creative media, they translate unconscious contents into forms that can reach broader audiences. Jung wrote extensively about how great artists throughout history served this function, creating works that revealed psychological truths before collective consciousness was ready to acknowledge them directly. Modern conscious artists continue this tradition, helping to make the unconscious conscious through creative expression that speaks to deeper layers of human experience. The therapeutic mastery pathway leads many highly perceptive individuals toward healing professions, but Jung emphasized that effective therapeutic work requires complete integration of one's own perceptive abilities. The wounded healer archetype represents someone who has transformed their own psychological suffering into wisdom that can serve others. Jung taught advanced techniques for therapeutic work with superior perception. Conscious mirroring involves reflecting clients' unconscious contents back to them in ways they can integrate gradually rather than being overwhelmed. Archetypal interpretation helps clients understand how their personal struggles connect to universal human patterns. Energetic containment allows therapists to hold clients' psychological material safely while maintaining their own boundaries. The most advanced therapeutic practitioners learn what Jung called transpersonal healing, working not just with individual psychology, but with collective, unconscious contents that manifest through their clients. They recognize when personal symptoms reflect larger cultural shadow projections and help individuals understand their role in collective healing processes. Educational transformation represents another crucial pathway for integrated superior perception. Jung observed that traditional educational systems often suppress the very psychological developments most needed for human evolution. Conscious educators work to create learning environments that honor psychological complexity and encourage authentic development. These educators develop curricula that include psychological literacy, teaching students to understand their own inner worlds and recognize psychological patterns in others. They create classroom environments where emotional intelligence is valued equally with intellectual achievement. They help students understand that their own psychological development contributes to collective consciousness evolution. Jung emphasized that conscious education must address not just individual development, but collective psychological patterns. Students learn to recognize cultural shadow projections, understand how media and social systems influence consciousness, and develop the psychological discernment needed to navigate complex modern environments. The systems transformation work attracts highly perceptive individuals who recognize that personal integration alone is insufficient if collective systems continue operating from unconscious patterns. These individuals apply their perceptive abilities to understanding and transforming organizational, social, and cultural structures. They develop expertise in recognizing when institutional dysfunction reflects collective shadow contents, understanding how unconscious psychological patterns manifest in social systems, and creating organizational structures that support rather than suppress psychological development. Jung believed this system's work represented one of the most important applications of superior perception in modern times. As collective challenges become increasingly complex, humanity needs individuals capable of perceiving the psychological roots of systemic problems and designing solutions that address unconscious as well as conscious factors. The research and documentation pathway serves consciousness evolution by creating intellectual frameworks for understanding psychological phenomena that exceed current collective comprehension. These individuals translate their perceptive insights into academic, scientific, or philosophical language that can reach broader audiences. They conduct research into consciousness intuition and psychological development, using both traditional scientific methods and innovative approaches that honor subjective experience. They document case studies of consciousness evolution, create theoretical frameworks for understanding superior perception, and build bridges between ancient wisdom traditions and modern psychological understanding. Jung emphasized that this intellectual translation work is crucial for helping collective consciousness evolve beyond current limitations. Without rigorous documentation and theoretical development, perceptive insights remain isolated individual experiences rather than contributing to broader human understanding. The spiritual guidance mastery emerges when individuals learn to channel their perceptive abilities into spiritual service, without falling into guru complexes or spiritual inflation. These individuals help others develop their own connection to transcendent reality, rather than becoming dependent on external spiritual authority. Jung taught specific principles for conscious spiritual guidance. Non-attachment to outcomes allows guides to offer wisdom without needing others to accept or implement it. Empowerment orientation focuses on helping others develop their own inner authority rather than creating dependence. Psychological grounding ensures that spiritual insights integrate with practical psychological development rather than becoming escapist fantasies. The most advanced spiritual guides understand that their role is to point others toward their own inner wisdom, rather than positioning themselves as ultimate authorities. They serve as temporary bridges between others and their own deeper knowing, facilitating connections that ultimately eliminate the need for external guidance. Collective healing facilitation represents perhaps the most challenging and important application of integrated superior perception. These individuals work directly with collective unconscious contents, helping groups, communities, and cultures process shadow material and integrate it consciously. They facilitate community healing processes around collective trauma guide organizations through transformation of unconscious dysfunction, and help cultural groups understand and integrate their collective shadow projections. This work requires extraordinary psychological strength and sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and collective psychology. Jung warned that this level of work is extremely demanding and should only be undertaken by individuals who have achieved deep personal integration. The facilitator must be able to hold collective shadow contents without being overwhelmed, while maintaining enough objectivity to guide effective integration processes. The consciousness research advancement draws individuals toward understanding the nature of consciousness itself. These researchers investigate how consciousness evolves, how perception can be expanded and refined, and what factors support or inhibit psychological development. They study both individual consciousness development and collective consciousness evolution, documenting patterns across cultures and historical periods. They investigate the relationship between individual psychological development and broader cultural transformation, seeking to understand how consciousness pioneers contribute to species-wide evolution. Jung believed this research represented humanity's attempt to understand its own evolutionary process consciously rather than simply being carried along by unconscious forces. As collective challenges require higher levels of consciousness to address effectively understanding consciousness, development becomes crucial for species survival and thriving. The creative innovation application channels superior perception into developing new solutions for complex modern challenges. These individuals perceive possibilities that others cannot see, sensing potential innovations before they become obvious to broader society. They work in fields ranging from technology and business to social innovation and environmental solutions, using their ability to perceive underlying patterns to identify breakthrough approaches. They often appear ahead of their time, proposing solutions that seem premature, until changing circumstances make their relevance obvious. Jung observed that many major innovations throughout history emerged from individuals with superior perception who could see possibilities beyond current collective imagination. These consciousness pioneers help prepare humanity for developments that become necessary as evolutionary pressures intensify. The cultural bridge building attracts individuals who can perceive common ground between seemingly incompatible worldviews, political positions, or cultural perspectives. They recognize how apparent conflicts often reflect projection of internal contradictions and help facilitate genuine dialogue across differences. These bridge builders develop skills in translating between different worldview languages, finding shared values beneath surface disagreements, and creating environments where authentic communication can occur across ideological divides. They help heal collective polarization by addressing its psychological roots rather than just its surface manifestations. Jung believed this bridge-building work is essential for preventing destructive collective conflicts and facilitating the cooperation needed to address global challenges. As human societies become increasingly interconnected, the ability to facilitate understanding across differences becomes crucial for species survival. The conscious leadership development pathway prepares highly perceptive individuals to guide organizations and communities from places of integrated consciousness rather than unconscious authority. These leaders understand that true leadership serves the development of others rather than the aggrandizement of the leader. They develop skills in recognizing and working with collective, unconscious dynamics, in groups making decisions that serve long-term collective well-being rather than short-term individual gain, and creating organizational cultures that support rather than suppress psychological development. Jung emphasized that humanity desperately needs conscious leadership as collective challenges become increasingly complex. Leaders operating from unconscious patterns create organizational dysfunction that mirrors and amplifies broader cultural problems. Conscious leaders help organizations become vehicles for positive transformation rather than unconscious destruction. The reality creation mastery represents Jung's most advanced teaching about the relationship between consciousness and external reality. Highly integrated individuals begin recognizing how their inner psychological states influence their external circumstances through mechanisms that transcend purely causal relationships. They learn to work consciously with synchronicity, understanding how inner psychological integration manifests as meaningful external coincidences. They develop awareness of how their consciousness affects the people and situations they encounter, taking responsibility for their energetic impact on their environment. Jung taught that this reality creation ability emerges naturally from deep psychological integration, rather than being a technique to be learned. When individuals become truly conscious of their own psychological contents and learn to participate consciously in collective, unconscious dynamics, their external reality begins reflecting their inner development in increasingly obvious ways. The ultimate integration involves what Jung called individuation, in service of the self with a capital S, the archetypal principle of wholeness that seeks expression through individual development. At this level, personal integration serves transpersonal purposes that extend far beyond individual concerns. These individuals recognize that their psychological development contributes to a larger evolutionary process that involves all of consciousness. They understand that their inner work serves not just their own well-being, but the development of human consciousness as a whole. They become conscious participants in what Jung called the divine drama of consciousness, coming to know itself through human experience. Jung believed that individuals who achieve this level of integration become immortal in the sense that their consciousness contributions persist beyond their physical lifetimes. They participate in what he called the eternal aspect of the psyche, contributing to psychological developments that will continue influencing human evolution for generations. This represents the ultimate transformation of Jung's dangerous discovery. What begins as overwhelming perception that threatens to destroy the individual eventually becomes conscious participation in the evolutionary forces shaping humanity's development. The dangerous gift becomes a conscious contribution to the transformation of human consciousness itself. If you recognize yourself anywhere in this progression of development, you are part of what Jung considered humanity's evolutionary advance guard. Your psychological struggles and breakthroughs contribute to pathways that others will follow as consciousness evolution continues. Share in the comments where you recognize yourself in this developmental spectrum and what challenges you're currently navigating. Subscribe for continued exploration of Jung's most advanced teachings about consciousness development that serves not just individual well-being, but the evolution of human awareness itself. Remember that your integration journey, however difficult, contributes to preparing humanity for the consciousness developments that our collective survival and thriving will ultimately require.